Good afternoon. My name is Alexina Chapman, and I'm with the City of Austin Watershed Protection Department. The reason we're here today is to talk about a flood risk reduction project. This project is planned to take place in the Slaughter Creek watershed in the neighborhood that includes and surrounds Vassal Drive, and we're planning to start studying this area later this year. This project is being initiated in response to complaints that we have received about flooding in the area. This slide shows the citywide local flood complaints that have been submitted throughout the city. And unlike creek flooding, where water in the creek overflows the banks, local flooding usually happens when there aren't enough storm drain pipes to capture and move all the water away from an area. So there have been over 6,600 local flood complaints that have been submitted across the city. And the flood complaints shown in red are for buildings that have flooded. And these can be buildings, but they can also be homes or garages or other structures on a property. The dots in yellow show yards that have flooded, and the dots in green show areas of the street that have flooded. And typically neighborhoods built before the 1980s tend to have more drainage problems, either because there was no drainage code when those neighborhoods were built, or because the drainage codes were insufficient. And unfortunately, there's usually no quick or easy solution to these types of issues. These tend to be large projects that take a lot of time and money to implement. And today we're going to be looking at a project area located in South Austin near Davis Lane and Menchaca Road, right here where this white marker is shown. So this slide shows the project area, and the area is about 120 acres. And the project boundary roughly follows the drainage basin. So that means that when it rains, most of the water that falls within this area would stay within this area, and we would expect it to drain towards the Comberg detention pond. There have been 21 local flood complaints submitted since the year 2000. 15 of these complaints are related to buildings that have flooded, or in this case, homes or garages that have flooded. 4 of the complaints are about yards that have flooded, and 2 are areas of the street that have flooded. This slide shows the existing storm drain infrastructure, and the storm drain infrastructure in this area was built in the 1980s and is undersized. So you can see these lines in black here show the underground pipe system. And these connect to 2 drainage ditches that are on either side of Vassal Drive and run parallel to Vassal Drive. So in a storm event, we would expect water to flow through these pipes, flow into these drainage channels, and then flow into the detention pond just east of Comberg. And then eventually the water flows out of the detention pond and meets up with Slaughter Creek downstream. This is a preliminary flood model that shows the flooding that we would expect to happen in a 100-year storm. And a 100-year storm is a storm that has a 1 in 100 chance of happening any year. And another way to think about this is a storm that has a 1% chance of happening in any given year. So we think the reasons that we're seeing flooding in this area is because there aren't enough storm drain pipes, or the storm drain pipes were built too small and aren't able to handle all the water that would fall in a storm event. And so basically these pipes are filling up, and the water isn't able to enter the pipes, and so it's just flowing across the land the same way it would have before this neighborhood had been built. One of the goals of this study is to increase the accuracy of the flood modeling. So if you live in this area and are familiar with the flooding patterns, and you're noticing somewhere on this map that does flood and is not necessarily being reflected, then that's something that we would absolutely like to hear from you about. And I'll provide more information later on in the presentation on how you can get in touch with us. So as I mentioned earlier, these can be long projects, and there's typically 5 phases to a type of project like this. So the first phase is an in-house feasibility study. And in this case, this has already happened. And this is where, we look at the area and we make sure that this is an area that's suitable to study, and that there are feasible potential solutions that could be implemented to reduce the risk of flooding. The next phase is the preliminary engineering phase, and this is where we are now. So this initiates a formal study where we would hire a consultant to look in more detail at the area and to propose improvements that could be implemented to reduce the risk of flooding. At the end of this phase, the most feasible alternative is identified to take to the next phase, to the design phase. And we would revisit with the neighborhood to present the outcome of this phase before moving on. We expect this phase to take about a year and a half. So then next would come the design phase. And this is where details are refined from the preliminary engineering phase, and construction plans are developed. These construction plans are then used in the permitting and bidding phase to acquire permits for the project. And also, this is when a construction contractor would be hired. And finally, the last phase is construction. And this is where the improvements that were identified earlier would finally be implemented. We would expect this whole process from start to finish. This can take anywhere from 5 to 6 years, and sometimes it can take longer depending on what's uncovered in the earlier phases. The goal of the preliminary engineering phase is to prepare a preliminary engineering report, or PER, which includes alternatives to reduce the flood risk to buildings, yards, and streets in the area. So the first step is to collect data to learn more about the flooding causes and impacts. This will include field studies, surveying, and locating existing utilities. And you can expect to see crews working occasionally in the area to collect this information. The next step is to model the existing conditions to identify the number of homes currently at risk of flooding. Next, we would develop and assess alternate proposals to reduce flooding in the area. These alternates would consider cost, constructability, and the amount of benefit provided. The alternatives must not increase the flow downstream of the project, and this is because we wouldn't want to reduce flooding in one area only to increase it somewhere else. And finally, the alternatives will assess if any easements are required, and sometimes project alternatives may need easements to be feasible. So this will be considered as part of the PER, and if any easements would be needed, we would meet with the impacted neighbors before any easements would be acquired. So this slide shows the types of improvements that we'll be looking at as part of this project. And all the photos shown in this slide and the next slide are just generic photos of these types of improvements. And so the actual improvements in the area may look different than these. So first would be looking at inlets, and here you can see a photo of an inlet. Inlets are basically gaps in the curb where water can flow into. So when it rains, water falls onto the street, drains across the street, and drains along the curb and into the inlet. So we would be looking at adding more inlets and improving the inlets so that they can capture more water. And once this water is captured, it flows underground into a system of pipes. And we would be looking at either adding more pipes or increasing the size of pipes to help move water through the area and into the drainage channels. So where the pipe system meets the drainage channel, this is called the outfall. So you can see an example of an outfall here. And we would be looking at implementing improved outfall designs so that we can safely move water from the pipe system and into the channels. Once the water is in the channel, we'd be looking at making improvements to improve water quality, to limit erosion, and to increase the capacity of water that the channels can convey. Next, the water flows into the detention pond. And the purpose of a detention pond is to control the flow of water downstream of it. So the pond provides space for water to fill up during a storm and releases water at a slow rate to reduce any flooding downstream. So this project may look at adding additional water detention features or improving the existing detention pond east of Comberg. So the most important part of this presentation is that we're looking for your feedback to help us study this area by providing your experience with flooding. So if you have experienced flooding but have never reported it to the city, or if there were areas which flood and which weren't reflected on the flood map that was shown previously, then these are things that we would like to hear about. So you can provide details, photos, and videos of your flood experience. And all the information that's provided to us will be included in the study to make sure that that any recommendations really help reduce flooding as much as possible for your neighborhood. There are 3 ways to provide feedback. The first is to visit the project website at austontexas.gov/Vassal and complete the flooding information form. The next is to email information directly to floodpro_stormdrain@austontexas.gov. And finally, if you live within the project boundary, then you should receive a paper mailer, which includes a questionnaire, and you can return that paper questionnaire to us. So finally, I'd like to just talk generally about some available resources that can help protect yourself and others from damages due to flooding. So the first is to consider purchasing flood insurance. This can help protect your home and your property in case of a flood event. The next is to report flooding and drainage concerns to 311, and this can help us prioritize future projects across the city. Avoid building in drainage easements. This can block the drainage easement and it can cause unpredictable damage to yourself or to your neighbors. If you would like more information about flood-proofing your home or property, you can email floodpro@austontexas.gov. And finally, you can check atxfloodsafety.com for additional resources. This is the end of the presentation. If you have further comments or questions, please don't hesitate to contact me directly. Again, my name is Alexina Chapman, and I'm the project sponsor with the Watershed Protection Department. Jennifer Simmons is the project manager on the project with the Public Works Department, and her contact information is available here as well. Thank you very much for your time today, and I look forward to hearing from you.